My name is Sarah Mitchell, and my parents sued me. I'm not exaggerating. 2 weeks after I came home from deployment, I opened my mailbox to find a cream envelope with the county seal and my family's name printed in bold. Mitchell versus Mitchell. It looked like a typo until I read it again. They weren't sending me a letter, they were dragging me to court. I stood in my kitchen with the paper shaking in my hand, trying to understand how the same people who raised me could turn me into their enemy. My parents always believed life was a straight line. Work hard, follow the plan, and become what they dreamed for you. When I joined the Navy instead of going to medical school like they wanted, I broke that line. To them, it wasn't a choice. It was betrayal. I left home at 21 with one suitcase and no goodbyes. My father didn't look at me when I walked out the door. My mother said, "You'll regret this." I didn't. I served for 16 years. I earned my place, my rank, and a limp I still carry every time it rains. I came home with medals they never saw and scars I never talked about. I thought time might soften things, but silence grew heavier instead. When that summons arrived, something inside me stopped bending. For years, I tried to pretend their rejection didn't matter. But holding that paper, seeing my own name listed as a defendant, I realized this wasn't just about property, it was about pride. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat down, and stared at my reflection in the window. I wasn't the girl they'd once dismissed. I was a woman who had stood in sandstorms, watched men fall, and learned to rise quietly. 2 days later, I pressed my uniform one more time. The fabric still smelled faintly of salt and gun oil. I hadn't worn it since the funeral of my closest friend. That morning, I decided I'd wear it again, not for ceremony, not for pity, but for truth. If my parents wanted to face me in court, then they would see me for who I truly am. Not the daughter who disappointed them, but the sailor who never stopped showing up. Even when no one was watching. I grew up in a house where failure wasn't discussed. My parents were both surgeons. Success, to them, was a bloodline. It wasn't about choice. It was about legacy. My brother was already halfway through med school when I graduated high school. I was expected to follow him like a shadow. They bought me anatomy books before I could even drive. Our dinner conversations were filled with clinical terms and board scores. I learned early how to sit up straight, answer precisely, and never cry in front of people. We were the Mitchells, and Mitchells didn't make emotional decisions. At least, that's what my father always said. Then 9/11 happened. I watched the towers fall from a classroom TV and felt something crack inside me. It wasn't fear, it was clarity. I walked into the kitchen that night and told them I wasn't going to med school. I was joining the Navy. My mother dropped her glass. My father didn't speak for several minutes. Then he stood up, left the room, and didn't come back. I slept in silence that night, listening to the hum of the fridge and wondering if I had just ruined everything. The next morning, my acceptance letter to Duke's pre-med program was on the counter, unopened. A yellow post-it was stuck on top. "Don't do this." That was all it said. My heart pounded when I read it, not from guilt, but from a strange kind of grief. I enlisted the next week. My recruiter shook my hand like I mattered. It was the first time I felt seen for who I was, not who I was supposed to be. I didn't tell my parents until the paperwork was finalized. I knew what their answer would be. The night I left for basic training, my father stood by the door with his arms crossed. He didn't hug me. He didn't even look up. My mother stood behind him, her face cold and unreadable. She handed me my suitcase, zipped tight and clean, no note, no goodbye. I walked down the porch steps and into the waiting cab, trying not to cry. The driver asked if I was okay. I nodded, but I wasn't. Something broke in me that night. It wasn't the loss of comfort or home. It was the quiet confirmation that I wasn't wanted anymore. I called a few times from base, left voicemails, wrote 2 letters. No one replied. I convinced myself they were just angry and needed time. But birthdays passed. Holidays. Promotions. Nothing came. Eventually, I stopped checking the mailbox like it mattered. That silence became a wall I learned to live beside. I'd tell myself I didn't care. I built a life on discipline, grit, and the hope that someday I might be enough to be welcomed back. That maybe one day they'd look at me not as a failure, but as someone they could be proud of. But pride doesn't always work the way we hope. Sometimes it stiffens into resentment, and instead of a hug or a phone call, it shows up as a lawsuit. I started writing letters to my parents on my first deployment. I didn't know what else to do with the thoughts that piled up after lights out. So I wrote. At first, they were just updates. Safe. Still adjusting. The food's bad. You'd hate the coffee. I signed each one. Love, Sarah, even though I didn't know if I still had the right to. As time passed, the letters changed. I started telling them things I couldn't say out loud. The smell of burning plastic after an explosion. The silence after the gunfire was louder than the noise itself. I wrote about Knox, the explosive sniffing dog I was assigned to, and how his presence made the nights feel less empty. Some days I felt proud enough to believe I was doing something that mattered. I described the kids in the village who smiled at us, even after everything they'd seen. I wanted my parents to know I hadn't joined for glory. I joined because I needed to believe I could protect something. I hoped that if they read those words, they'd understand. I kept the letters in a tin box under my bunk. They piled up fast. I told myself I'd send them someday. Maybe after my last tour. Maybe when I had enough medals to make them proud. Maybe when I believed I deserved a reply. Then Carter died. He was my teammate. Loud, funny, obnoxiously good at poker. One morning, he stepped into the wrong alley before sunrise. We heard the blast before we knew it was him. I found the last letter he wrote to his wife in his pack. It never made it home. That night, I sat on my cot and looked at my own stack of letters. Dozens of them. Unread, unsent, useless. I stopped writing after that. It felt pointless to tell stories no one would ever hear. My thoughts became quieter, more private. I learned to carry them in silence. Still, sometimes I'd wake up with sentences forming in my mind. What I'd tell my mother if she asked how I was sleeping. What I'd say to my father about the day Knox and I found a cache of weapons. But no one asked. No one ever did. I started talking more to Knox. He listened. Never judged. He'd rest his head on my boots at night like he understood what I needed. I'd run my fingers through his fur and pretend I was back on my porch, just a kid again, with my whole family inside, waiting. But those memories grew blurry. Faces faded. Voices lost their edges. What stayed sharp was the ache. The wondering. Would they even recognize the person I'd become? Would they care? When my service ended, I packed up the letters. I never threw them away. I couldn't. They were the only proof I had that I'd tried to stay connected, even when the silence on the other end was louder than war. My grandfather passed away 2 months after I came home. He was the only one who still called me on Christmas, even if it was just for a minute. The last time we spoke, he told me he kept a picture of me in uniform next to his favorite chair. He said, "You didn't follow the path they laid out, but you made one that matters." That stayed with me longer than I expected. When the will was read, I learned he'd left me a portion of his estate. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to matter. A small lake cabin, some savings, a few things he said I'd earned the right to keep. I didn't expect anyone to be happy about it, but I didn't expect a summons either. When the envelope arrived, I stared at it for hours. My parents were suing me, claiming undue influence, alleging I wasn't fit to inherit. I didn't shout. I didn't send a furious reply. I folded the papers, placed them in a drawer, and made myself a cup of tea. My hands shook as I stirred in the sugar, not from rage but from something colder, something like finality. Whatever thread had once connected me to them, it had snapped. I knew I needed help, but not just any lawyer. I reached out to someone who had helped me once before, when I came back from my second tour and couldn't sleep. His name was Jack Davis, a retired Army colonel turned legal advocate for veterans. He didn't ask for details. He just said, "Come by the office, bring everything you've got." I walked in the next morning with my service file and a box of old citations. Jack flipped through the paperwork slowly. Then he looked at me and asked, "Do you want to fight them?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "I just want to stand for what's right." He smiled like he'd been waiting for that answer. Over the next few weeks, we worked quietly. We didn't draft scathing statements or counterattacks. We collected facts, deployment logs, commendation letters, witness testimonies from former commanding officers. One of them had written a citation after Knox and I had cleared a path for a medical convoy under fire. I'd never read it closely until then. The words, "exemplary leadership under extreme pressure," caught in my throat. I found a photo I'd forgotten about. It showed me kneeling next to Knox, both of us covered in dust, with 3 Afghan children standing behind us, blinking into the Sunday. That mission wasn't headline-worthy. It didn't make the news. But it was the day I realized what service really meant. Jack told me, "You don't need to prove anything to them, but you deserve to be seen." That's why we prepared our case with precision, not emotion. I wasn't there to win an argument. I was there to defend my grandfather's trust and my own name. I didn't tell anyone else what was happening. I didn't post about it. I didn't complain. I kept going for early morning runs. I trained with Knox in the park. He was retired now, and mine. I cleaned the small cabin my grandfather left me, as if it were sacred. Because in a way, it was. It was the first place that was ever mine. The night before the hearing, I took out my uniform and laid it across the bed. My navy dress whites. The metals still clinked softly when I moved the hanger. I ran my fingers over the stitching. It had been years since I wore it, but it still felt like armor, not the kind that repels bullets, the kind that holds dignity. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want apologies. I wanted the truth. I wanted to walk into that courtroom and let them see what they turned away from. Not through words or fury, just by standing there, in full view, and that was enough. The courtroom doors opened, and every head turned. I stepped inside wearing my navy dress whites. The heels of my shoes clicked once against the tile, and then silence swallowed the room. My uniform was crisp. The ribbons on my chest told stories no one in that room had ever heard. My cover rested in my hand. My spine was straight. Not stiff, just sure. I scanned the room without rushing. My parents sat on the left side, their lawyer whispering something into a folder. My father's shoulders stiffened before he looked up. When he saw me, his mouth parted slightly, like he was seeing a ghost. My mother blinked twice. Her eyes dropped to the metals, then quickly turned away. She shifted in her seat, like the bench had suddenly become too hard. I walked to our side of the room and sat down next to Jack. He didn't say a word, just gave me a small nod, the kind that says everything and nothing at once. The bailiff called the room to order, and the judge entered. Everyone stood. I stayed focused on the bench ahead, not the faces trying to read me, not the family that had already decided who I was, long before this day. The judge flipped through a stack of documents, glasses perched low on her nose. Then she looked up. "Senior Chief Mitchell," she said. "You may approach." That title hung in the air like a bell. I saw my mother flinch. My father dropped his gaze. I rose without hesitation and walked to the witness stand. I didn't trip. I didn't falter. I just moved with the steady pace they drilled into me years ago. When I sat down, the uniform stretched smoothly across my frame. It still fits, every seam, every crease, earned and remembered. The clerk asked me to state my name for the record. I said it clearly. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Mitchell. The words echoed against the wood-paneled walls. They didn't sound boastful. They sounded true. They sounded final. For a second, no one moved. The judge nodded slowly and turned the page. It was only then that I noticed my father's hands. They were gripping each other tight in his lap. Like if he let go, something might break. I didn't smile. I didn't smirk. I just sat there, breathing in the weight of the moment. All those years of being invisible to them. All those letters they never saw. Now, they had no choice. I was here, present, named, seen. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one who felt small. The lawyer asked me to explain my relationship with my grandfather. I told the court he was the only one who ever called to say happy birthday. He once mailed me a paperback novel about World War II with a note that read, "You're braver than the characters." I said we didn't talk often, but when we did, he asked about me. Not my grades, not my resume, me. Then he asked about my service. I didn't list ranks or awards. I told a story. One day near Kandahar, I said, we got a call about a school that had been shelled. When we arrived, the smoke was still rising. My K-9 partner Knox and I were tasked with clearing the building for survivors. Oh, I paused and looked toward my parents, but not directly at them. Inside the rubble, there were 3 children. A boy had a broken arm. The 2 girls were barely conscious. Knox found them first, under a collapsed desk. We carried them out using our jackets. No cameras. No press. Just dirt, heat, and urgency. I said I didn't bring that up because it made me special. I brought it up because moments like that change how you see everything. You learn to act fast, speak less, and carry the weight without expecting thanks. I said that was what service meant to me. Not rules, not politics, just doing the thing no one else is willing to do. I could feel the courtroom holding its breath. No one shifted. No one whispered. I told them about the girl who wouldn't let go of my hand as the medic wrapped her wounds. She kept whispering something over and over. I never learned what it meant, but I remember how tightly she held on, like she believed I could save her, like it mattered that I was there. Then the lawyer asked why I thought my grandfather left me part of the estate. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. I said, because he saw me. I didn't elaborate. I let the silence answer what words couldn't. The last question came. Did you ever try to reconnect with your parents? I said yes. Letters, voicemails, all unanswered. Then I turned slightly, looked in their direction, and said softly, you never asked. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. That was the moment something shifted. Not in the case, not in the courtroom, but in the air between us. The part no judge could rule on. The truth had been spoken, and it hit harder than anger ever could. The verdict was read in a voice flat with procedure. The judge ruled in my favor. The estate would remain as written. There was no applause, no gasp, just a quiet shuffle of papers and the slow rise of chairs. My parents didn't speak. Their lawyer packed up the files without looking at me. Jack leaned over and whispered, that's it. I nodded once. My hands stayed still in my lap. Outside the courthouse, the sun felt warmer than I expected. I stood near the steps, holding my cover in one hand, and watching people drift away. Jack gave me a look that said, you okay? I said I was. Not happy, not proud, just steady. That kind of steady takes years to build. I didn't see my father approach until he was almost beside me. He stood a few feet away, like he wasn't sure he had the right to close the gap. He didn't clear his throat, didn't look around nervously. He just stood there in silence for a long beat, then asked, did it hurt? Leaving? His voice wasn't angry or soft. Just tired. Like the question had been waiting inside him for years. I looked at him without blinking. Every day, I said. But it made me stronger. My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I was giving him a truth I had carried alone for far too long. He nodded. Just once. No apology. Followed. No explanation. That was all he had in him. And for some reason, it felt like enough. Not because it fixed anything, but because it was real. Honest in a way he'd never been with me before. I didn't ask him to stay. He didn't ask me to come home. We stood there quietly until the breeze picked up and people started to pass between us. Then he turned and walked away. I watched him go, not with bitterness, but with the calm that comes from finally being seen. Sometimes, a verdict doesn't come from a judge. It comes from the moment someone finally asks the question they should have asked years ago. Even if they can't say sorry, even if it's too late to start over, that question still matters. And so does the answer. It was quiet at the cemetery, the kind of quiet that settles deep in your chest. I stood alone at my grandfather's grave, the morning air still clinging to the grass. The headstone was simple. Just his name, dates, and one word underneath: honor. I knelt and placed the envelope on the stone. Inside was the first letter I ever wrote from overseas, the one I never sent. It was creased at the edges, the ink a little faded. I slipped in a small photo, too. Me at age 7, sitting on his lap, both of us wearing paper hats from a barbecue. He'd written "troublemakers" on the back in pencil. I sat beside the grave for a while, just breathing. No rush, no need to speak. I thought about the years between then and now, about the space that silence builds, and the strange comfort that comes when you stop needing people to be different just so you can feel whole. Forgiveness wasn't something that came easily for me. It took more discipline than boot camp, more than combat. Forgiveness isn't letting someone off the hook. It's choosing not to carry their choices like a weight on your back. It's turning hurt into space, and space into peace. I forgave them not because they asked for it. They didn't. I forgave them because I needed to stop burning energy on something I couldn't change. I forgave them because I didn't want to live as someone defined by pain. I wanted to live as someone defined by strength. My grandfather once told me that being strong doesn't always mean being right. Sometimes it just means knowing when to stand still and let the storm pass. I think about that often now, especially on days when old memories try to crawl back in. As I stood up to leave, I ran my fingers gently over his name. "Thank you," I whispered, "for seeing me, for leaving me something no one else would. A place to return to when I needed to remember who I am." I walked back to the car slowly, the sun just starting to warm the edge of the horizon. One step at a time. No rush. Just clarity. Forgiveness is the truest form of discipline, and I learned that in uniform.